Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Today is January 15th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world and other stuff. Let's see what Agent Smith has for us. Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. Chilling. Just got back from a trip to Southern California. Got to see my girlfriend and got to check out the game studio of Frost Giant and test out some cool stuff there. Have you heard of Stormgate?
I think you've mentioned that before. That's supposed to be like the new RTS coming out.
Yes.
So how's that looking?
Incredible. It's mechanically really crisp and fast. It's got I think a really good foundation in terms of how the engine is built, so the unit control feels really good. It's still pre-alpha, so nothing that they're ready to like have a bunch of people be playing online and stuff, but definitely really talented people who know what they're doing, and they have a super good start that they're working with. Yeah, I'll put a note in the Discord. Wish list Stormgate on Steam. New RTS. Yeah, so I was asking them while I was there, what's the main way we can help you guys promote the game? Because a lot of the people on this game development team were on the StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void team or the Warcraft 3 team. So in the past, they had this massive company, Blizzard, that could take care of a bunch of stuff for them if they needed resources or needed assets of whatever kind. You've got huge departments of people who can do all that stuff, whereas now they're working on their own. So a different set of challenges, but they know the genre really well and they know what the StarCraft community wants for sure. So comparing it with some other stuff I've tried, like it already plays way better than Age of Empires 4 in terms of a snappy and poppy RTS, so I'm hella stoked.
Snappy and poppy.
Yeah, like you tell a unit to move and it instantly moves. There's no latency. The movement is really crisp and clear. It just feels really responsive.
Has that been a problem in other RTSs?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of RTS games can't be a competitive esport because they feel gross for pro gamers to play. Sometimes they have really good story, or the decision making in it is really interesting, like the tech paths are cool, maybe the campaigns are good, but if the unit control is kind of sloppy, then you're not going to get those pro gamers who consistently play it and make it into an esport.
Oh, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so they've spent a lot of time basically digging out a huge chunk of the Unreal Engine and then building that up from scratch so that the engine supports RTS better. The engine itself wasn't really made for RTS. I think by default it would be better for a shooter game or an adventure game where you have a small number of units in play at a given time. But RTS, you can have hundreds of units. So they wanted to do some really fundamental changes to how all of that worked.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Does it have a single player mode?
Yeah, the plan for them is to have like campaigns and stuff, 1v1 as a primary mode, and then 3v3 as another primary mode.
Yeah, I'm preternaturally terrible at PvP in virtually any game.
Yeah, but they're going to have a lot of PvE in it as well.
There you go. Well, here's looking forward to playing it several years after release. Since I can't buy it at the initial price. That's generally the way I do things now.
Yep, it'll be free to play, so if you can't afford $0, you must be in some debt.
Free to play, really?
Yeah, they're going to do free to play.
Oh, wow. How are they going to make that work?
Skins.
Oh, really? Oh, so they're doing like a Path of Exile type thing.
Yeah, I think Dota does it that way too, where that game is free to play, but they have all kinds of different things that you can buy. They have battle passes and that sort of thing, so they'll probably go that route.
Huh.
Yeah. I think it's good. It makes your audience more global because in certain countries with like less purchasing power, but maybe they have decent internet, they can't really play expensive games that are like the $60 level or $80 level. But if it's free to play, then you get a bunch of people. I think that's part of why Dota 2 has a really massive global community of people in a lot of countries. Some of them are less well off, but if you have a computer and you have internet, you can play it.
Here's looking forward to it. I can definitely afford Zero.
Yeah.
That is well within my price range.
Good. Chat's asking, is Agent Smith a gamer of some sort? Yes, he is. What have you been playing lately?
Of some sort is a very broad category, so yes. Path of Exile lately. I actually have been getting back into that. I had to swallow my pride and basically just flatline all of the graphic settings to get it to work acceptably well. It could work before, but in a game like Path of Exile, reaction time isn't important, and it doesn't therefore behoove you to have lag spikes or the game freezing up on you or that kind of thing, even if it's just for a couple seconds. So that had been a big enough problem for a long time that I'd actually stopped playing it for, gosh, probably a couple of years. But then I finally just set it on the Diablo 2 settings.
Nice.
800 by 600 resolution, and then just bottom of the barrel graphic settings in every possible category. And that seems to work. It seems to be playable now, at least for me.
Are you using the same computer that you used back at Kukio's place?
I am.
Wow.
Still works.
Heckin' dinosaur at this point.
Well, he did a good job. He was a smart guy.
Yeah.
He built it himself. Good investment on my part. I've definitely gotten my money's worth out of it.
Absolutely.
A little buggy at times, but within acceptable boundaries.
And usually you try to update stuff about 10 years after it's standard. So smartphones, you get a new computer upgrade in about 6 years. Call it good.
We'll see if I have the money. We'll see how it goes. Well, is there anything in particular going on you wanted to kind of get to?
Chat mentioned something about a plane crash that had like first person video or something. I don't know if there's really news to talk about that, but it was definitely a different perspective than people normally see. Probably pretty scary. I didn't see it.
Yeah, that was breaking news today. There was a plane crash in Nepal. But I didn't read the article because I just figured, well, plane crash is a plane crash. But I hadn't heard about the first-person perspective. That's news to me.
Yeah, apparently different from vantage point of other ones. There was one audio recording that I heard. It was from quite a few years ago now. I don't remember the exact year, but there were two pilots, pilot and a co-pilot, and they had their kids up in the cockpit, and they were letting their kid fly, and because they were messing with the steering, it disengaged the autopilot, and they ended up stalling it into a free fall, and then it crashed. It's like heckin' disastrous. Yeah, that's
How many people were on board?
It was a full flight, I think. So I would guess over 100, but maybe it was less than that. Someone can fact check all that.
Yeah, it's probably best to not let children into a cockpit.
Yeah.
Especially on an airliner.
Yeah, if I'm thinking about who I want flying the plane, if I'm a passenger, a small child is not the ideal pilot for me.
I concur. Yeah, that kind of reminds me of some other famous accidents. There was a plane crash in Germany, I want to say 10 years ago, something like that. And the plane basically just nosed down and then flew right into the ground.
Damn.
And it was not immediately clear what had happened. But then it turned out, looking at the, they looked at the data from the black box and, audio recordings and what evidence they had, basically. And they determined that after further investigation, that one of the pilots was actually suicidal and that he had crashed the plane deliberately.
Mm.
Yeah, that was a fully loaded flight. It was probably around 100 people or so.
Yeah, in that situation, though, you end up mixing in a bit of murder with that one, too, if you have all the passengers on there.
Yeah, murder-suicide.
Yeah.
I don't imagine the pilot in question particularly cared at that point.
Yeah. There was the person in Seattle a few years ago who was not a pilot, but they boarded a plane and flew it around. I don't know if you remember that.
I think I saw a video of that a couple months ago. I think it was making the rounds on Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he hopped into it's a relatively small plane. It was just a sort of little 2-engine passenger plane.
Mm-hmm.
And he just decided to go for a joyride, basically. But he had no intention of ever landing it, it seems. It kind of was basically his last hurrah before crashing it into the ground. There wasn't anybody on board. He didn't take anybody with him, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, suicidal people and heavy machinery are not a great combination.
Yeah.
I also remember, since you mentioned not letting somebody at the controls who shouldn't be there, there was an incident over near Japan. I don't remember exactly where, but it was off the coast of Japan. There was an American submarine that had a journalist on board. And, they were kind of showing her around, doing the usual PR thing. And then they asked her, hey, do you want to breach the surface, right? They have this maneuver. I don't know what it's called off the top of my head. Somebody in chat would know better than me, but basically it's where the submarine, while underwater, ascends rapidly and then basically jumps out, like nose first. And they decided to do one of those with the journalist at the controls, just to kind of let him try it. It turned out to be a pretty dumb idea, because as it happened, they breached the surface right underneath this Japanese boat. I think it was a fishing boat or something. And I think they killed pretty much everybody on board, or at least several of them. It was not a great it was not a great moment for diplomatic relations. So the captain in question got in a lot of trouble for that, clearly. Probably pretty awkward for the journalist, too.
Yeah. Hadn't heard of that one.
Yeah, that's an older one. I think it was like aughts. I remember reading about it in the news when it happened, but yeah, probably more than 10 years ago, that one. Well, I don't have too much specific to get to. There's kind of been little things happening here and there around the world, but it wasn't anything that kind of jumped out at me in the notes.
Relatively chill week, then?
Relatively chill week, plane crashes aside.
I'm glad my flights were okay. We had a lot of turbulence flying into LAX because they had thunderstorms there. And it was bumpy enough that when we landed, there were people on the flight who clapped because they were happy that we survived.
Yeah, people don't have a lot of faith in the structural integrity of their aircraft when they're going through turbulence. Yeah, I don't know. The turbulence is really the thing to worry about, but it can be intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, what's going on? Well, did you see that Mohammed bin Salman was granted immunity?
No. Immunity from what?
Do you remember that journalist that the Saudis dismembered in Turkey?
Uh-huh.
So Mohammed bin Salman was, is sort of the prince of Saudi Arabia. He's sort of the de facto leader right now. He's not the king, but he's been given de facto control over the executive.
Yeah, I think we talked about that before. He's younger and more active, but he doesn't control all power, but they're kind of letting him manage stuff.
Yeah, he's kind of being groomed, most likely, for the, what would you call it, to become king later. So he got in a lot of trouble over the whole Khashoggi thing, the journalist. And he was kind of not being ostracized per se, because, there were still ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia. But the United States government was at least pretending to care. And so they were sort of making symbolic efforts to kind of distance the US government from the Saudi government, while still maintaining sort of more subtle military ties, and ties relating to other areas of cooperation. But I think it was like a month or two ago, he was actually given immunity, I think by the State Department. And it had to do with the fact that he's prime minister, which is a new status. He wasn't prime minister before. I don't think he really accrued any new power on account of it, although I could be mistaken. But the State Department cited that as the reason why they wanted to grant him the immunity. But more likely, they just kind of wanted to make a gesture to show good faith, because they do want better relations with the Saudis. There's a lot going on right now, Ukraine, Iran, etc. And coordination with the Saudis is going to be important to trying to deal with some of that, or at least trying to keep them from cooperating more with, say, Russia or China or what have you. So in order to ensure that the Saudis are kind of more aligned with the United States government has recently been trying to improve relations. And granting immunity here over the Khashoggi, well, they didn't grant immunity specifically over the Khashoggi killing, but effectively that's what it amounted to. So they're not going to go after him legally in the United States over that. So an outreach, an extended hand, if you like. The United States is trying to make nice here with Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi Arabian government generally, which they kind of needed to do, because it's not as though relations have been great for a while now. And I think everybody remembers when the Biden administration went to them asking them to increase oil production after the war in Ukraine started, which was pretty much a flop. Saudis were not interested. Much more interested in talking to the Russians about having some kind of coordinated policy on production. Yeah, Russia's not a member of OPEC, but they have been cooperating much more closely with OPEC in recent years, to the point where people have started referring to OPEC plus, which is OPEC plus Russia, basically. So that's a sort of emerging bloc, if you like. And certainly the Saudis have a lot more vested interest in maintaining market share in oil markets in conjunction, with the Russians than they do in cooperating with the United States on, say, Ukraine or China or something, which only really has peripheral relevance to Saudi Arabian security. They would love to work with us on Iran, but we're a little gun shy. We're not terribly interested in getting into some kind of broader conflict with Iran, or maybe even an indirect conflict. But that's exactly what the Saudis do want, because they're pretty concerned, suffice to say, about the threat that Iran poses to them and to the region writ large. If you're curious why the Saudi government would be, concerned about Iran specifically, that has to do with the rivalry between Iran and the Saudis that goes back a long time. It goes back probably early mid-20th century. The Iranians have always fancied themselves sort of the natural hegemon in the region. And the Saudis, in contrast, are kind of a newcomer. There was not really a united Arabia like there is now with the Saudis for most of the past 1,000 years. Yeah, you probably have to go all the way back to like the caliphates or something. But the Saudis successfully created what is now Saudi Arabia. And the country has always been pretty small. It didn't have a lot of resources initially. Oil kind of really made the country. So between being really new and heavily dependent on oil, but otherwise having a pretty small population and being historically dependent on foreign powers for security, Saudi Arabia is not really ideal in the minds of many people in the Middle East as a hegemon. They're happy to take the money when they offer it, which they frequently do, since that oil money is one of their principal foreign policy tools as far as influence. But the Iranians have a much bigger country demographically, economically. I mean, they have much more developed institutions than the Saudis do. The Saudis are trying to make up the gap. You know, they have been trying very hard to diversify their economy over the past 10 years and to try to build a stronger state apparatus with more state capacity. But that's a relatively recent project. You know, historically, the Saudi royal family depended a lot more on foreigners, specifically, you know, the United States and Britain, to provide for their security. So, but even so, like even when the United States, or you know, before then, the United Kingdom was the hegemon in the region, the Saudis were still sort of the well, not sort of, they were the protectors of the holy sites, right? What is it, Mecca and Medina. So the fact that those two sites are located in their territory gives the Saudi royal family a lot of prestige, because you know it's obviously very important to the broader Islamic faith. Well, those sites in general are important, but to have responsibility for providing security and then, you know, housing and caring for all of the, what would you call them, pilgrims? I don't think that's the right term, but basically people going on pilgrimage to Mecca, if not also Medina, those people have to be cared for. And so the Saudi government does that, and that gives them a lot of political capital, so to speak. And they've tried to leverage that along with the oil money to try to kind of build a broader role for themselves in the region over the past 10 years in particular. But again, it's a hard sell because they're dependent on foreigners historically and kind of still to the present, still in the present. And then their leadership is historically more educated in the West. That's true of a lot of royal families in the Middle East. A lot of them kind of send their children abroad for education, and then they come back. And so that's created some tension, but with some of the more conservative local elements, not least Islamists. And, you know, Iran used to be the same way pretty much with the Shah when he was in power. But after the Shah was overthrown, obviously, you know, the government became much more populist and much more, I don't want to say nativist per se, but, you know, it became much more nationalist in, you know, nature. And so that gave them a little more credibility in terms of being, you know, separate and independent from, you know, these sort of meddling Westerners who have been in the Middle East for so long. So this tension between the Saudis and the Iranians, you know, and and the differences in their respective claims to legitimacy in the region, sort of are the bedrock of that rivalry. Again, you know, that goes back a long ways. You know, even when the Shah was in power, there was actually a rivalry there because the Iranians kind of wanted everybody in the region to more follow them, and they spent money to try to get people on side. And then the Saudis, of course, you know, kind of resisted that. And there was territorial disputes as well, you know, so that didn't help things. That's always a complicating factor. But when the Iranian Revolution happened, that really kicked the rivalry into high gear because at that point, you know, even though there had been a rivalry before, they still had pro-Western governments that were nominally on the same side in the Cold War. But when the Shah was overthrown, now they have a nationalist Islamist government. And they're at odds, you know, because the Islamists in Iran, you know, the mullahs, kind of had it as a kind of long-term goal to eventually expand Iranian influence in the region, and you know, perhaps at some point become responsible for, you know, protecting Mecca and Medina. They've never stated that as an explicit objective, but they do go out of their way at times to criticize the Saudi government that they're not doing a good enough job for, you know, this, that, or the other reason in their role as protector of the holy sites. So you know, I don't think they'll ever actually get that, but you know, they relish the opportunity to go after the Saudis on that count. And of course, they also call the Saudis, you know, stooges of the West because you know, they have such close ties with the West and whatnot. And they also compete for, you know, this is kind of a more recent thing, relatively speaking, basically since 2003 and the Iraq War, but they compete in territories along their periphery. So in Iraq, the Iranians have militias that they support. I've never really read about the Saudis supporting militias in Iraq, but I think that's just because they cooperate more with the United States in supporting nationalist parties. To a degree, the Sadrs, what would you call it? Muqtada al-Sadr, basically. His group isn't called the Mahdi Army anymore, but it used to be. That's kind of how I still remember it. But Sadr and some of the other sort of more secular and nationalist parties have a coalition, and in general, the Saudis have been more friendly with them. So there's competition in Iraq for influence. There's obviously competition in Yemen, where the Saudis have an ongoing war. The Saudis backed it's not really an interim government anymore. I don't think you can call it interim after it's been around for 10 years. But there was nominally a temporary government set up after the Arab Spring saw the overthrow of the then dictator of Yemen, Saleh. And that was the Al Mansour government, I believe. I think that's right. But anyway, the Saudis backed that government. And that was fine for a while, but then eventually the Houthi rebels in the north of the country got ambitious. The people in Yemen got very impatient with the Al Mansour government. They wanted faster change, they wanted democratization. They kind of felt like the Arab Spring and the revolution that, correspondingly happened in Yemen was not really paying off, and that some powers that be might be trying to sabotage it. So when the Houthis invaded, well, not invaded, but when they pushed south from their territory in the north of Yemen and took the capital, people were actually pretty receptive. They kind of trusted the Houthis more than the Mansour government. And at first, the Iranians were not really involved. At first, it was more about the Saudis not liking the Houthis, not liking the idea of the Houthis seizing control, because well before the Arab Spring, the Houthis and the Saudis had been sparring on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia for decades. It had not really been a constant thing, but it had been fairly intermittent, fairly predictable in that it would happen with some regularity, but not constantly. But the Saudis, they just never had real peace on that border with the Houthis, and so they assumed that it would just get worse if the Houthis did seize control of Yemen. So that, combined with the fact that Mohammed bin Salman was probably assuming that the Iranians would try to get involved and that they would try to align with the Houthis and would maybe try to set them up as an outpost of Iranian influence south of Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi government may have been trying to kind of preempt that possibility by jumping in and trying to guarantee a win for the Mansour government. That didn't work out. And as it happened, the fear that the Iranians would get involved ended up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, by expanding the war and turning it into a sort of a long-term conflagration. It basically became inevitable that the Iranians would try to send support to the Houthis, if only to bleed their rival out over some long protracted conflict, which is what Yemen became. So they compete there. Long story short, Iraq, Yemen, to a lesser degree, Syria. Obviously the Iranian government backs the Assad regime in Syria to the hilt. Mm-hmm. And the Iranians have, troops, volunteer militias, fighting in Syria. They also send a lot of money to the Syrian government, or at least, as much as they can spare. They're kind of tight for money these days, but they do send enough to try to kind of keep Assad on his feet, so to speak.
And that conflict is still going?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's still going. There was never any kind of peace. I mean, there was a decline in the intensity of the fighting. Things kind of did settle down, but they never fully stopped. Mm-hmm. And the different factions involved both within Syria and outside Syria still maneuver against each other like all the time. So it's an ongoing conflict in that sense. Yeah, I think for the past year or two, the conflict has become more, I don't want to say insular per se. It's a civil war. Of course, it's insular. Well, most of the factions involved are fighting kind of more with themselves at this point. So like the Assad government cut a bunch of deals with certain rebel groups after it kind of defeated them, that it would basically allow them to continue to exist, as coherent units if they agreed to integrate into the Syrian army. which they did. But in effect, that was basically tantamount to granting local warlords control over their local territory in exchange for tribute. So, basically Syria's political system devolved into a tributary system because the government just didn't have the money or power to do anything else. They could commit violence sufficient to suppress an area, but they couldn't like clean it out or govern it or rebuild it or anything like that. So warlordism basically became the answer to the problem of governance. But a lot of those rebel groups were not entirely pleased with that arrangement. It was kind of contingent on them getting regular payments as well as other privileges. And, the Syrian economy ain't what it used to be, suffice to say. And so some of those rebel groups have been getting, well, some of those former rebel groups, rather, have been getting antsy, and they've been fighting a little bit with the government. There's not been like a big rebellion per se. Mostly I'm talking about the South here. The South was subjugated like 2017, 28, whenever it was, several years ago. But now the rebel groups that were suppressed and cut deals with the government have been getting restive. And it's not clear how the government is going to deal with that. Probably violently. That seems to be their go-to. But there has been basically fighting within the Assad camp, effectively. The Turks, for their part, are still backing the Free Syrian Army in the northwest of Syria, in Idlib province, as well as in certain areas like along the Turkish border with Syria, just like on the Syrian side of the border, just maybe a couple miles or so. They still have a number of Syrian Arab fighters in the Free Syrian Army that they're kind of helping to maintain control there. Yeah, there was a time a couple years ago when the Assad regime decided to launch an attack on the FSA in Idlib, and at first it was initially successful. And the Turks were obviously pretty upset, but it wasn't clear that they would do anything per se, because, they want the FSA to do their fighting for them. They don't actually want to deploy the Turkish army into Syria. But because the Syrian army was taking ground, they eventually had no choice, and they actually sent the Turkish army in. They didn't send them in to directly fight the Syrian army. Rather, what they did is they sent them to these, what were basically observation posts. And those observation posts were, obviously very close to the front line so that they can, quote unquote, observe. And in effect, that was a dare. Basically, Turkey was daring the Assad government to attack Turkish troops in Syria. And he didn't take the bait. He didn't want to pick a fight with the Turkish army. I think part of the issue for Assad is that he was trying to goad the Turks into some kind of fight so that he could put pressure on the Russians to take a greater role in Syria. Because the Russians are like the main reason that the Assad government was able to survive the civil war. They were very much losing the war. Slowly, but they were losing before the Russians intervened. But then after the intervention, they were successfully able to turn things around and eventually retake a bunch of territory and effectively end the rebellion, so to speak, in Syria. At this point, it's not a rebellion anymore. It's just different countries sort of sitting on and occupying different tracts of Syrian territory and holding onto them as leverage in some hypothetical future peace negotiation that might happen in the far-flung future. It's a better characterization of the conflict at this point than civil war, really. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the Turks are still backing the FSA, and most of their focus has been more on the Kurds over the past couple of years. They're a lot more focused on, say, the PKK. Do you remember them?
Yeah, that's one of the Kurdish groups that I think the U.S. has loosely encouraged, but they're kind of squished up between a few different countries, and they want their own territory, but no dice.
Close. That's a better description of the YPG, which is like the Kurdish militia way back in Syria.
Oh.
The PKK is the separatist terrorist group in Turkey.
Oh.
And the United States government actually does label them a terrorist group, so that's not me passing judgment. That is like the legal designation in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They've been fighting against the Turkish government for 40-some years, I want to say. And they're trying to get basically an independent homeland for the Kurdish people in Turkey. Or failing that, at least greater autonomy within Turkey, one or the other. They're pretty controversial because even if their cause kind of makes sense, it's almost sympathetic, but they have used quite a bit of terrorism over the course of their history. And so their record is somewhat tainted in that regard. Also, they have a weird cult of personality around their ruler. It's like this radical far left type organization. It's not just an ethno-nationalist militia, basically. It actually is sort of more of a, I'm not sure if it embraces communism specifically, but it is far left in nature. Their ideology is very much far left, and it has a kind of despotic organization where there's one guy, I think his name is Ocalan or something, who's just on top, and he's like the supreme leader of the group, and everybody's supposed to look up to him. And it's a very strange arrangement, basically. It's not exactly what you would expect. But the PKK, anyway, has been more active in recent years, ever since President Erdogan effectively restarted the war between the PKK and the Turkish government after several years of ceasefire back in, I want to say, like 2016, 2017, something like that. That was done basically for political reasons. There was an election coming up. The Kurds were supporting a party called the HDP, and the HDP was looking like it was going to make a lot of gains to the detriment of Erdogan's party, the AKP. And so Erdogan took the initiative and effectively instigated a return of that conflict, a resumption of the fighting, shall we say, between the Turkish army and the PKK. And after that, the HDP ended up losing popular support because it wasn't just Kurds voting for it. There was actually a pretty decent number of Turks who were starting to vote for it. But then the HDP lost Turkish support once the fighting started again. And then the government started putting limits and restrictions on the HDP because it had some ties, with being supported by Kurds. It was easy to paint the HDP as having links to the PKK. Because, of course, you could say, well, the Kurds vote for them, so it must be PKK, So that meant that they could not compete, really, on an even footing with the other parties in the election. And unsurprisingly, the AKP won big. So effective strategizing on the part of Erdogan there, although it cost no small price in terms of human life. And the fighting from that incident, from that decision, is ongoing. You don't hear about it in the news much, but you do see videos sometimes. I think there was a subreddit that used to exist. I think it's since been banned. That was our gun battles, something like that, or gunfights. And a not insignificant amount of the footage actually came from Turkey, and it was basically just PKK militants fighting with Turkish army soldiers. So they would drone each other, snipe each other, murder each other. They murdered each other's prisoners. Seems like that's a war crime. Not sure why you would post that on Reddit, but somebody did. But yeah, lots of violence there.
Committing crimes on camera, not the smartest play.
Yeah, you'd think not, but some people, I guess, want style points or some shit. But the PKK has links to the YPG, the Kurdish militia in Syria. And that has the Turkish government on edge. For them, there's no difference between the PKK and the YPG. They think they cooperate with each other, and basically that the YPG in Syria gives safe haven to PKK militants, and that Turkish security requires a crackdown on the YPG. That's a problem because, again, the United States backs the YPG, and we actually have troops in Syria to act as a deterrent against aggression, mostly by the Syrian government, but also kind of low-key against the Turkish government as well. So the result has been that the Turkish government has increasingly focused in recent years on trying to needle the YPG where it can, as much as it can without consequence. Obviously, the United States could apply a great deal of pressure if it wanted to. So the Turks have to be subtle. They'll kind of assassinate somebody here in the YPG, maybe push into some Kurdish territory that's outside of the YPG's core of support. Really, the United States only backs the YPG in eastern Syria, because that's where the Islamic State was. So, technically, the United States government justifies its involvement in eastern Syria as necessary to fight the Islamic State, even though IS hasn't really been a thing now for a while. That's still the nominal justification. But there are Kurdish areas, there are areas with Kurdish populations outside of eastern Syria where the YPG is active, and those groups and those territories are not actually protected by the United States. And so the Turks have kind of homed in on them as one way to try to either attack them directly, in order to try to deal with the threat they pose, or to apply pressure in order to act as leverage in negotiations with the YPG, so they can try to extract concessions. They've also been teasing an invasion, another invasion anyway, of Kurdish territory in the north. I don't know if you remember, but way back in like 2018, 2019, Donald Trump had a phone call with President Erdogan. And Erdogan basically said, hey, can you like pull US troops away from the border between Syria and Turkey so that we can send our own troops into that region and occupy it just for our own security? And of course, that's basically just an excuse to try to take the territory, so that one, it can be within Turkey's sphere of influence, but also so that they can go after the YPG there in that border region. But Trump said yes, and he pretty much immediately ordered it done. And so the result is that the Free Syrian Army, along with Turkish elements, moved in to a zone basically 10 miles into Syrian territory from the Turkish border. And, it was pretty ugly. I mean, there was a couple of people who had worked for the YPG administration in those territories who were killed. I remember one video of a woman who'd like been mayor of a town who was just pulled out of her car and shot to death by a Free Syrian Army militiaman. So that wasn't great, but on the plus side, it did somewhat ease the pressure. The Kurdish issue, such as it is a thorn in the side of Turkish-American relations. So that did serve to kind of appease the Turks, at least for a while. So let's see. So that's pretty much Turkey and Syria. Russia's still kind of sort of there, but they kind of have bigger problems at this point, so they're not that active these days. Iran has been kind of trying to move in a little more because to fill the vacuum left by Russia, basically. So they've been sending more troops, supplies, missiles, what have you. But that's basically just instigated Israel, which has been intermittently launching airstrikes in Syria for the past, well, basically since the start of the conflict, pretty much. But it's been particularly intense the past couple of years. Israel does not want Iran to have a forward presence in Syria, either in the form of militiamen or rockets or, whatever. So whenever they find a large cache of weapons that the Iranians had moved over, they just bomb it. They don't really ask permission. They just kind of do it. They actually had an agreement with Russia where they would be able to do that without getting their jets shot at by Russian air defenses in Syria. So they had this deconfliction mechanism set up where the Israelis would kind of let them know roughly where they were going ahead of time, so that the Russians wouldn't shoot at them. Yeah, that kind of was brought into question recently. I think in the past couple months, there was kind of a falling out. The agreement is still kind of sort of in place, but the Russians were not entirely pleased with the Israelis sending some equipment to Ukraine. I don't think they were sending aid per se. I think it was just sales. The Israelis sell a lot of military equipment and whatnot. So they actually did take a pot shot at an Israeli jet at one point. That is to say, Russian air defenses in Syria. Didn't stop the Israelis. They've continued on as before, pretty much. But they have been trying to continue to strike a delicate balancing act, between the Russians and between their own interests. They don't want to piss off the Russians too much, lest they, really start investing in air defenses in Syria and make it much harder to launch those airstrikes. But at the same time, they do see it as in their national security interest to carry out those strikes. Mm-hmm. I think if push came to shove, they would probably just suppress Russia's air defenses in Syria. I think they just want to avoid escalation because that would be expensive, much more so than just talking to the Russians and using the deconfliction mechanism. The Saudis, for their part, kind of work more with the United States. There's actually one weird little pocket on the border of Jordan and Syria. It's sort of in the southeast of Syria. I don't remember what exactly it was called. There's like a specific town there. But it was taken by rebels very early on in the Syrian Civil War. And basically the West, the United States, the Jordanians and the Saudis, went out of their way to develop ties to the rebels along the Jordanian border. I think it was called maybe Daraa. That isn't it. But anyway, rebels still control that territory, and the reason they do is because we're sort of supporting them. Not as explicitly as the YPG in eastern Syria. That's sort of a different thing. We're supplying the rebels along the Jordanian border more indirectly, and probably the Saudis are taking the lead more on that, since it's closer to their allies' territory anyway. Jordan and the Saudi Arabia, they have relatively close ties. The Saudis generally have good ties with most of the Gulf monarchies. Well, most of the monarchies. Jordan's not a Gulf monarchy. The obvious exception being Qatar. That has more to do with personal enmity between the royal families than anything else. It's an old rivalry that kind of goes back a ways. But yeah, that's just a rough idea of what's been going on in Syria the past couple years. Suffice to say, the war has not ended. It's still going on.
Remind
Dragging
me,
out.
what was the impetus for the civil war? Like, what did the rebels want?
Arab Spring.
Arab Spring, okay.
Yep. It was one of the manifestations of the Arab Spring way back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, at first it was just protests. There was like mass protests against the Syrian government demanding, more representative government, more open government, less, open brutality, kind of a feature with pan-Arab nationalist governments in the region. And predictably, the government responded with violence. So, I think for much of the first year of the uprising, it was just peaceful protests. And as the government cracked down more, killed more people, tortured more people, more and more of the Syrian army started defecting and joining the protesters and forming what were effectively militias and designed to protect the protesters. And eventually, those militias grew in size to the point where they could challenge the army. Not really directly. The army was always, better equipped and whatnot. But, they could use hit and run tactics, go after civil infrastructure, civil society. Well, not civil society, but, you can assassinate like local mayors and stuff. You can go after the local political officials, police and whatnot. And if you can get rid of them, it becomes exceptionally difficult to really govern territory. Effectively, even if there's still a military presence in a given territory, if there's no infrastructure of governance, then they only have a very tenuous hold over that territory. So, in time, they were able to slowly eject the Syrian government from broad swaths of Syria, specifically northern Syria and southern Syria. Southern Syria, because that's basically where the protests had started. So that was sort of the bastion of the resistance from the start. And then in the north, they also had sort of a major node of the rebellion up there because of support from the Turkish government. Eastern Syria was not actually a major front. What happened in eastern Syria is that the Kurdish population basically declared neutrality. The government still lost control over time because they had to redistribute forces elsewhere. But instead of taking the opportunity to challenge the government for control, Kurdish militias formed and basically had an uneasy peace with the Syrian government. That's actually why there's an airport, like in the far, far northeastern corner of Syria, that's been controlled by the Syrian government from the start of the war. They were never ejected from there, even though that whole area is mostly controlled by Kurdish militias, because the Kurdish militias never went to war with them, really. Their whole thing was basically just protecting themselves. So they were not for the government, but they did not actively participate in the rebellion either. And as a result, the Syrian government was able to redeploy most of its forces to the west of the country to deal with the major rebellions in the north and south. And the upshot for the Kurds in the east is that they got more de facto self-government. Damascus was not in a position to stop them. So it was quite happy to play along with the neutrality arrangement that they had. That worked pretty well until Islamic State blew through and basically just steamrolled all of eastern Syria. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the history after that event. That's when the United States jumped in, along with various Western allies and Gulf monarchy allies, started supporting the Kurdish militias and trying to beat back the Islamic State, which they eventually did. It took a lot longer than I would have expected, but they were able to do it eventually. Not sure where I was going with that. Lost my train of thought.
I was asking why the rebels did the rebellion.
Oh, the genesis of it. Okay, yeah. Yeah, Arab Spring is it was started out as protest, then militias formed to protect them, and then support from outsiders, and then it just spiraled out from there. Yeah, for a long time, it looked like the rebels were slowly winning. It was grinding, but the Syrian government, the army rather of the Syrian government, was obviously being ground down over time. Like they were losing people and running short of troops to the point where they had to start recruiting militiamen, militia volunteers from like Afghanistan, Iran, weird places like that. Hezbollah and Lebanon also contributed troops to help them out. And obviously, the Russians eventually, intervened and kind of turned things around for them. But before that, yeah, they were definitely just haggard. They were exhausted. The economy had been obliterated. The government wasn't making any tax revenue, so they couldn't hardly pay anybody. So as a result, they had to, well, like I said before, the political system devolved into warlordism. So, because they didn't have any money to just pay people and keep them loyal, what they did is they started giving local leaders of army units or militia units or what have you de facto control over the economies in local areas. So there wasn't really much money to be made because, again, the economy was decimated. But what economic activity remained in various territories was de facto given to the local warlords of one sort or another. And there was a whole variety of different actors who kind of filled that role. Some of them were actually related to Assad, some of his cousins, basically, who were, I think one of them was the leader of an elite military unit. And he was given de facto control over something like scavenging or something. Yeah, you can't really, there's not a lot of construction going on, but given all the destruction that happened, there's quite a bit to scavenge and salvage. And so scavenging operations produce a pretty decent amount of money if you're a local warlord of one kind or another. You're just taking money or taking metals rather, or other construction material from destroyed buildings. You can kind of sell that abroad. You're not supposed to be able to do that. There's lots of sanctions on Syria in order to try to prevent actors related or actors connected to the Syrian government from making money by selling on international markets. But what they would do is that they would actually do deals with smugglers in Lebanon. So Lebanese smugglers would take stuff from various actors in Syria and take those goods into Lebanon and then sell them from there, and then they would basically give a cut to the Syrians. So basically, the Lebanese smugglers were acting as middlemen between the broader international economy and the Syrian government. And that worked for a long time. But then Lebanon's economy imploded. I think everybody remembers that.
Ooh.
It was back in 2020. Yeah, the so-called, allegedly, it's one of the worst economic implosions since the late 19th century. So pretty bad. COVID really did a number on them, but they were already hurting even before that. COVID was basically the coup de grace.
Why were they hurting before it?
It was a combination of just corruption and bad regulations, and the fact that the regional economy was already softening in 2019. The Lebanese economy is pretty much dependent on two things. One, tourism, and two, remittances. So because the regional economy was weakening, that meant that there was less hiring of Lebanese laborers. And so they basically lost that source of revenue. Lebanese workers go abroad, they earn money, and then they send it back as remittances. That's an important source of foreign revenue. But a lot of those workers just work in different countries in the Middle East. And so when the regional economy did worse, a lot of those people just went home, and that was just a net loss for aggregate demand in Lebanon's economy. And tourism wasn't doing great either in 2019. But the real issue, though, was that the banking system was just corrupt. It had been just borrowing money left and right with no end in sight. And so that kind of applied pressure over time to public confidence in the banks. So I think there's other details to it I'm not remembering exactly, but effectively it all led to a run on the banks in like late 2019, early 2020. I remember that was one of the things we talked about at the time. But the result is that Lebanon effectively ran out of foreign reserves. And so anything that was imported became way, way more expensive. And because Lebanon is a disproportionately import dependent economy, like most small economies, that just hammered them. It just crushed them. And so then COVID came along and just obliterated their other major economic driver, tourism, and that was pretty much it. That was Lebanese economy was pretty much done after that. And the result has been a mass exodus. There's a lot of emigration, people trying to get out, and just a lot of suffering. People can't even afford like basic medicines because there's just no money to be made. And even if you can make money, like it's generally in the local currency, so you don't have any actual hard currency to buy the imported stuff you need, including medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really rough for the common people. But the point is that because Lebanon's economy imploded, that actually really damaged what was left of the Syrian economy. Because again, Lebanon was that de facto intermediary between Syria and the rest of the world. And when they lost, all of that capital, all of that money, just in general, because the economy took a nosedive, the Lebanese middlemen were not as able to fulfill that role. And so the result is that prices fell, the Syrian government took a hit to revenue, and things just kind of got worse for them. And the political system ended up kind of fracturing and devolving even more. Interesting fact for you. Even having said all of that, as bad as things are in Syria with its economy and whatnot, it's actually gotten even worse over the past year, actually over the past year or two. And that's because of all the inflation. So, Syria, small economy, they have to import a lot of stuff too. Obviously, very difficult to import stuff when you have lots of sanctions, even more when the smugglers who had been supplying you are basically unable to fulfill that role. But now there's inflation, so all the stuff that you have been using, your, ill-gotten money, from smuggling and drug trafficking and all the other things the Syrian government has been doing, all of a sudden that money doesn't go as far. So, in addition to not being able to export stuff, now they can't even really afford imports, what little they were bringing in. So I actually read an article in the BBC about how people in Syria are saying that economic conditions now are actually worse than they ever as worse as they've been since the Civil War started, which is saying something because the economy is just decimated, from all of the fighting over the past 10 years. So quite awful, basically, at this juncture. Just the economies of Syria and Lebanon have just been absolutely just crushed under the weight of events over the past 10 years.
Damn. Do they have any natural resources or anything that they might be able to rebound with, or?
In Syria?
Yeah, like.
No, actually. That's kind of a myth. It's kind of a myth that, all of the countries in the Middle East have lots of oil and that they make, just shit tons of money off of oil. But that's only true for like a certain number of countries. Like basically, there's a huge oil reserve. Well, there's a huge set of oil deposits, let's put it like that, in the Persian Gulf. And there's a whole bunch of countries there that have territory there in the Persian Gulf. The Saudis do, the Kuwaitis do, the Iraqis do, the Iranians do. And, all of those are major oil exporters, but effectively they're all tapping the same set of oil deposits. Like the oil deposits that they're all kind of extracting from is basically in the same region there. So any Middle Eastern country that does not have access to that specific area is not oil rich. So Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, not oil rich. They don't really have significant amounts. They have some, and it is an important driver as far as local economies, especially now that the rest of the economy has basically collapsed. The Islamic State famously was able to make a pretty good chunk of their revenue from oil sales from Syrian oil rigs, but that's not the same thing as saying they were bringing in like oil sheik money. Like the money Islamic State was bringing in was a lot if you're a terrorist group, but it's not a lot if you're Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or something,
Mm.
the amount of money from Syria's oil income is relatively minuscule compared to the Gulf monarchies. They really bring in money, especially the Saudis, from their oil exports.
And
So no,
the
sorry.
Gulf monarchies are Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar,
Mhm.
Bahrain, Kuwait.
Yeah, Kuwait. Uh, yeah, that's all of them. Oman, if you want to throw them in as well.
Mm.
In the case of Qatar and the UAE, they have some oil, but their bigger thing is natural gas, especially with Qatar. They've got a big, huge ass natural gas deposit like right in their territory.
Hmm.
So they're kind of more focused on that. But no, the Syria just doesn't have a lot of like big natural resources.
Hmm.
So, even when their economy was doing well before the Civil War started, it was still just like a fairly poor developing country. It was still disproportionately agricultural with some nascent manufacturing going on. It seems like a long time ago, but the Assad government was actually improving its relations with the West before the Civil War started. Assad had been trying to reach out, had been, making little token reforms here and there to try to appease Europe, and the United States, and to try to get them to open up trade a little bit. And, that worked. He was kind of rewarded with some trade deals and stuff. And Europe in particular was stagnating at that time, especially like the UK and France. They were very much looking for business deals abroad, after the Great Recession in 2008. So they were pretty happy to kind of meet Assad in the middle, so to speak. They kind of knew that he was still a dictator, but everybody was pretty happy to pretend like the moves he was making were substantive.
Mm-hmm.
So that brought in some decent investment money, and the Syrian economy was slowly improving. And then the civil war started, and yeah, everything kind of went to shit after that.
And Assad has been ruling for how long?
I want to say he took power like in the mid late 90s. I think that's when his father, Hafez al-Assad, died. Yeah, Bashar al-Assad was not supposed to be dictator of Syria. His father actually had been grooming one of his other sons to succeed him. That was actually his eldest son, I believe. And he died in like a car crash or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but basically, the guy who was supposed to succeed, Hafez al-Assad, died, and so the job kind of defaulted to Bashar al-Assad.
Hmm.
And I think nobody was more surprised by that than Bashar al-Assad. he was he was like studying to be a dentist or something in the UK at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he actually has a British Arab wife, interestingly. Yeah, I think he married her while he was in the UK studying.
Hmm.
So, he kind of had his own thing going on for a while. And then just because his brother died, he had to kind of come in and fill his father's shoes as the head of their extended patronage network, which is the real power in Syria, like it is in most authoritarian countries. And he was never, I don't know that he was ever really well suited to it. I mean, his father looked like a dictator, but Bashar looks more like an accountant. He doesn't really have the dictator vibe to him. So you can kind of tell he was not the first choice. Yeah, I'm sure his family was happy to have him. Um, not for the reason you might think. I think rather that, in an authoritarian political system where you have like a family elite, there's invariably jockeying within the family for power. So if you have a strong patriarch, they can keep that under control. But after Hafez al-Assad died, I don't get the impression Bashar was able to manage that as well. So there's been relatively more infighting, and some of the more peripheral members of the family have been much better at extracting concessions and value, basically, from Assad's dependence on their loyalty than some of the earlier generations had been when Hafez was still in power.
Yeah, Moss said Wikipedia says he came to power in the year 2000,
Ah, okay.
and
2000.
he won 97.3% of the vote. Holy smokes.
Yeah, dictator numbers.
Wow. How do you think they decide numbers like that if they're just going to make it up?
It's dumb. It's dumb. Like, it's not fooling anybody. I
They
don't even
make it
know.
more obvious by having the number be that extreme than if like, okay, you won by 65%. All right,
Exactly.
that's pretty normal.
Yeah, the United States government actually had that problem in Vietnam because the first dictator of South Vietnam was a guy named Diem. And, the CIA told him, there's an election coming up. Like, we know that you're going to rig it. In fact, they probably encouraged it. But they did warn him, don't rig it so that you win like 99% of the vote.
What do you think
So
he
what did,
did?
what do you think he did? He went and won 99% of the vote.
Wow.
And I mean, the CIA must have just had like a facepalm moment. Like, really? Like, we told you not to do that, and you did it anyway. Why?
Ego.
Oh, it must have been. So, unsurprisingly, Diem had a lot of problems with legitimacy very quickly in his regime. He became very unpopular. Part of that was because he was Catholic, and
Mhm.
South Vietnam was predominantly Buddhist. That's not a problem in and of itself, but he was like a chauvinistic Catholic. He was like, you guys need to be Catholic. You can't be Buddhist. So he had all these discriminatory rules and laws that he imposed. And so, of course, all the Buddhists in South Vietnam were like, well, screw this guy. He doesn't know what he's doing. We need to support the communists. They didn't necessarily think of them as communists at the time. It was actually more like the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh was sort of an umbrella organization, a nationalist grouping that combined different parties together, including the Communist Party. But of course, the communists were the real leaders. They kind of headed it and used it as their vehicle to power, something that was not readily apparent to many people at the time. But regardless, the Viet Minh had a lot more legitimacy as a substantive and honest manifestation of Vietnamese nationalism than anything going on in the South Vietnamese government. And so the result is that Diem just lost a lot of support. The Viet Minh found it very easy to win support amongst locals and build local militias, and eventually a full-scale guerrilla war manifested. And that was pretty much the instigation for U.S. involvement later on. Uh, it didn't happen immediately. It wasn't like, Diem was unpopular, so we sent people. We did send some advisors and stuff, but we didn't actually start sending troops until 1965, I believe. So, from roughly 1956, after the Treaty of Paris kind of divided Vietnam and set up the new South Vietnamese government, between 1956 and 1965, there was sort of a slow but steady burn of of the South Vietnamese government losing support, and then the Viet Cong building up as a substantive fighting force and slowly ejecting the South Vietnamese government from the countryside. And Diem, for his part, eventually just lost the confidence of the US government. And we did not necessarily help assassinate him, but I say we, I should say the United States government and the CIA were approached by the guys who were plotting to assassinate him. And we kind of said, that's fine. We're not going to help you per se, but we're not going to tell on you either. So we kind of turned a blind eye to it and let them overthrow the government, kick Diem out. They didn't actually tell the US government they were going to kill him. In fact, the Kennedy government told them not to assassinate him. They were kind of hoping that they would just push him out of power and then he could claim asylum or something. But as was, they shot him to death on the night of the coup. So much for that. A little bit ironic considering what happened to Kennedy later.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's even after Diem was out and they had a general basically in charge, things didn't improve much. It didn't really start improving until 1968, weirdly. That's when the Tet Offensive was crushed. Things went much better after that, but by then the US public had lost confidence in the war, and it was basically just a matter of time before the North was able to breeze in. That's one wild ass tangent. What were we even talking about?
I think,
Syria?
yeah, we were talking about Syria, how the civil war happened, and then
Oh,
I think,
Assad. Yeah, that's what it was. We were
yeah,
talking about Assad. and his 99, what was it, 97% election victory.
Yeah, and you were talking about other big wins.
Yeah,
Quote
yeah,
wins.
Yeah, it doesn't really need to be over like 70%, I'd say. Anything more than that and you're tempting fate.
Have there been, it kind of makes me wonder what were the legit elections that were really one-sided like that. Because there are
Like
probably,
honest, genuine elections?
yeah, genuine elections or it was landslide.
Oh, let's see. That's tough. Hmm. I'm trying to think of an example of the United States. Maybe that's not the best way to go about it. We're notoriously divisive here. Nixon won really big in his second election. What was that? 1972, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then it was like a year later that Watergate happened. He
Whoops.
got kicked out. But he actually won like a huge chunk of the vote. But I don't
Zelensky in
remember.
Ukraine, people are saying?
Did he? I don't think that was a landslide, though. But maybe I'm mistaken. Yeah, I think maybe your best bet would be some of the democratization governments, like some of the governments that were formed after the end of an authoritarian government generally saw democratization party, the parties responsible for, pushing for democratization. Generally, they would win really big after the
Hmm.
fact. So India National Congress, Africa National Congress, groups like that historically have done exceptionally well. Although
Looks like
not so much in the past couple decades. Go ahead.
Zelensky won by with 73% of the vote.
Oh, that is very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, credit where credit is due.
Chat's also
Yeah,
saying
nothing.
George Washington won by a whole bunch.
Well, that kind of goes back to what I was saying. After the overthrow of a government or of something like that, then yeah, the
Usually,
freedom fighter is generally very popular.
yeah, the heroes have a whole bunch of clout to work with.
And we're starting a little late today.
Yeah, I did
Any-
an interview about Stormgate before I started my stream, so I started a couple hours
Oh,
late.
how cool! Who were you interviewing with?
Uh, a content creator called Beowulf, he does casting for StarCraft events, and he started up a
Oh,
project called Stormgate Nexus, which is like a news group where he writes articles and does interviews and stuff and just posts updates on the game.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a really smart play for a content creator to kind of field the upcoming games that are not out yet and try to get your foot in the door early because that gives you a first mover advantage for uh, something. And if it takes off and he already has that website really ironed out and fleshed out, then hell yeah, it's going to be big.
Best of luck to him.
Yeah, the game is in a really good spot relative to like what stage of development it's in. But I have big faith. I went into it cautiously optimistic and I left very optimistic. I threw caution to the wind.
So you're a booster.
Yeah. One funny thing that they invited us to after is rock climbing. Apparently a whole bunch of the team there, they just rock climb as one of their leisure activities after work. So it was cool getting to see people who you would normally consider to be like nerdy engineer software people types, like actually jacked and climbing really crazy holds and stuff on the wall. It was badass.
Huh.
Yeah. Even
Rock climbing.
the CEO, Tim Morton, is heckin' doing it too. Leading from the front. I like that. All right, guys, we're going to do some team building and go rock climbing. But, sir, we are computer nerds. Doesn't matter. That's an excuse. We need to get ahead of the other gaming companies. Tim is doing it. Yeah, he's good, actually.
such physicality from people who do programming.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of strategy and technique to it with like how you manage your like foot placement, how you keep your arms extended so you don't just waste all your upper body strength and stuff. But yeah, definitely a good way to stay in shape. They were talking too about how it has a lot of the same feedback loops of incremental progress that learning an RTS does, where there are a lot of subtle things that to a beginner you don't even see them, but for an advanced climber it's like one of the most crucial aspects of getting a lot of the different holds and executing the maneuvers.
I'm definitely going to have to take a look at that game.
Yeah, you can sign up for the beta as well. I'll link you the site for that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Honestly, I have never been rock climbing in my life.
Yeah, it's definitely a spookier activity for people who don't like heights. My girlfriend was with us, Trisha Payne. She also streams on Twitch, and she doesn't like heights and was like, maybe I'll do the bouldering or I'll climb up a little bit. But after she climbed a little bit over halfway up twice, she got like maybe 5 holds away from the top, and we were all cheering around like, you're almost there, just a few more. And she went all the way up to the top, which is pretty awesome.
Well done.
You have a lot of ground animal instincts that on a very visceral level tell the rest of your body like, hey, we shouldn't be up here. If we fall down, it would hurt. And your brain doesn't really understand the integrity of the rope system that you have on yourself, because they're really good about doing that if you go to a rock climbing gym where you're very securely fastened in. You have like a main knot and then a safety knot, and then you have another person check it. So it's all done really well. But yeah, on a primal mammal level, we should not be up that high generally. If you did fall, it would hurt.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I would go splat.
Oh, the rope
Those
is
buffalo wings would get scattered all over everybody.
Yeah, I'm thinking like when you kill a Dota hero, a bunch of gold coins explode and people get gold, and when Agent Smith explodes, it's buffalo wings everywhere.
I'm afraid so. Yeah, many years of poor dietary choices do not make one particularly fit. Certainly not for rock climbing.
Well, then you'll be issued the 20-minute walk punishment. Good luck this week. Chat was asking about Libya, an update on Libya.
Oh, Libya. I haven't seen them in the news recently. I do know that last year there had been an attempt to negotiate a new election in which both the Western and Eastern governments would participate and recognize the results. That did not happen, suffice to say. I don't even think they made it to the actual election. It ended up getting delayed over and over again, and I think finally they basically just scrapped it. Yeah, the United Nations, I think, sponsored that deal, but there's just so much mistrust between the two governments. There's been a not insignificant amount of fighting in the West, I think, over the past year. I think mostly it's just jockeying for smuggling routes, which can be very lucrative. Yeah, but other than that, I haven't heard much. Yeah, so I can't really update you per se, because I don't know that there's a whole lot to update on. If I followed it more closely, I would probably have more specifics, but as is, I basically just hear about it when it makes the news, and the only time it makes the news is when either somebody is trying to cut a deal between the new governments or when that deal fails. So basically, my coverage of Libya is a bit binary in that sense, so I don't get all the nuances of like the maneuverings by individual militias and stuff like that. Actually, we could make a map, couldn't we?
Maps are fun.
Got me thinking about that. Yeah, if you look at like major conflicts and failed states and whatnot, then you can kind of see a pattern. They're kind of all around Saudi Arabia. Yeah, you kind of can't blame them for being overly paranoid. Yeah, because there was that Ethiopian Civil War as well, the war with the Tigrayans.
Hmm.
And Somalia is still quite the mess. So between that and Syria, Afghanistan, etc., yeah, it's kind of a rough neighborhood. Let me see. Do you just want wars, or do you want like just broken down, broken, failed states as well?
Sure, let's do both.
Do both. Okay. Red is a good color, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Iraq's not a failed state, though. I wouldn't put them in. Not quite, anyway. It's messy, but it does have a nominally functional state. It's just not very powerful. More power in Iraq right now is vested in the different militias at this point. If you don't have a militia, you're not even really a political party. You pretty much have to have at least some dudes with guns in order to be taken seriously.
Hmm.
Yeah, the protesters are nice. They're idealists, they're nationalists, but they kind of need protection. They would be much more impactful if they armed up, most likely. Do I color Russia red? I mean, they're at war, but the war isn't really in Russia. I think I'm just going to do Ukraine for that one. Failed states. Active wars. I'm going to throw Ethiopia in, even though the war is basically over. It's shaping up a little bit. And we've talked about the Sahel before, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, there's been a whole bunch of coups over there too. That kind of ties into the overarching socioeconomic turmoil. I think last year rather, there were three separate coups in West Africa. But it was Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso, I believe. Guinea had the best one. They the coup there overthrew a dictator who'd been in charge for like half a century or some shit. And the guy who did it was an officer in the army who had been trained by the French. He actually had a pretty interesting origin story. He was kind of a quiet guy, kind of stoic, but also very professional, had been in special forces, that kind of thing. So charismatic sort of guy. He seized power, actually caused aluminum prices to spike, as I recall. Don't ask me why, but Guinea has a huge-assed aluminum smelter. I don't know how they got it. Maybe from aid, or maybe they just went out of their way to build it, but they do have one. And so whatever happens in Guinea tends to influence aluminum prices as a result. Congo's not a failed state, is it? Not really. It's bad, but it's not. It's mostly like the east of the country. Although there is fighting, though. I guess I'll color them red. This is going to be really broad,
Hmm.
so don't read too much into it. Failed state, wars, and then countries that are pretty close to failed state. Let's see, Myanmar. I'm sure this is very exciting for the people listening. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do it as quickly as I can. I'm probably going to miss some, but this is like the main one. He's like the main event, so to speak. I think I'm going to go with this then. All right. So I can post that in Discord and I'll send it to you directly.
Cool.
Let's see, Discord, Neuro, and then I'm going to attach something. No, I don't. Why do emojis exist?
It should be the plus of like upload a file.
There it is. Thank you.
Agent Smith went to send me a map and he sent me a winky emoji.
all of those emojis are coded,
Uh-huh.
and there actually was a conference in which major industry actors and countries got together in which they agreed on a common international set of codes for each of those emojis. So there was at some point in time a serious effort by serious people in business suits around a conference table to come up with some kind of code to represent an emoji representing a pile of shit.
Yep. The suits, they've agreed that we should have a drool emote. This is our word. Let it be set into stone.
There you are.
The Costa Ricans were lobbying hard for the heart eye emoji.
There you go.
Californians were going for the sunshine emoji. Okay, so we have a map. The red is at
Failed states, wars, and near failed states.
Cool. So, center this. I'll zoom out and then zoom back in so the viewers can see. So this is all the way zoomed out. Zoom in a bit. We've got Myanmar here. We talked about that one on the last episode.
Yeah.
I
forgot Yemen.
This is Syria. Did you forget Yemen? He looks red.
Oh, no, I didn't either. Okay, there it is. Probably should have gotten Haiti in retrospect.
Is this Iran?
What is this?
Oh, sorry, I was looking at it on stream.
Yeah, the stream's lagged a little bit, so I'm behind you.
There's India, Pakistan, and up and left from that.
Oh, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, right. Because the Taliban took over. Thank you. And then this one is Ukraine. This is Syria, Yemen. This is like a fun quiz. Libya. And then you got Yemen. This is Somalia has the Horn of Africa.
Horn of Africa is Somalia, and then Ethiopia is immediately west of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then west of that is South Sudan.
And then north of that is just regular Sudan.
Yeah, regular Sudan.
But not North Sudan.
Well, it was all Sudan at one point, but the South wanted to break away, and there was a long war, and eventually they were able to achieve independence. I think they're the most recent independent country. Yeah, the United States played a big role in trying to negotiate that. Mm-hmm. So South Sudan is kind of one of the legacies of the Obama administration. Unfortunately, it didn't go very well after the fact. The different, two of the major leaders in South Sudan pretty much almost immediately started fighting with each other. And so there's been very frequent violence in South Sudan since independence.
Like fist fighting or using their militaries against each other?
I don't even know if you can call them militaries, really. It's mostly like militiamen. Yeah, militiamen engaging in like hit and run attacks, raids, cattle raids even. Cattle is a big industry there.
And then west of that?
Central African Republic is west of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they've been having problems for 10 some years now. Like there was a authoritarian government, and then they were overthrown after some Muslim militiamen from the north seized the capital. Mm-hmm. But then they started abusing people, so there was a coalition of Christians, Christian militias rather, in the south that banded together and kicked them out. They were called the Anti-Salika. And since then, it's just been a clusterfuck. Basically just different militias fighting with each other. Mm-hmm. And then west of that is Cameroon. Cameroon is mostly okay, but there's a province in the west that's actually been trying to separate from the rest of the country. It's actually a really weird conflict they have going there, because it's not an ethnic conflict like you might expect in Africa. Rather, it's more about linguistics. So the northwestern province in question actually used to be a part of Nigeria. And I want to say after World War II, they actually had a referendum there in which they voted on whether or not they wanted to remain part of Nigeria or whether they wanted to join with Cameroon. And the reason they held that referendum is because the ethnic group there is actually the predominant ethnic group of Cameroon and not Nigeria. So they actually did vote to join Cameroon, but there was a problem. Cameroon had been a French colony, whereas Nigeria had been a British colony. So everybody in British colonies, if you were educated anyway, was taught English. And of course, in French colonies, it was French. Now, that was a problem because uh, institutions of government like education, also, just general administrative stuff like getting a license or something, like all of that was done in the language of the colonizer.
Hmm.
So if you were taught English, for example, then that's kind of what you expected to use when dealing with your government. But if you were an English speaker in this western province of Cameroon, your English didn't really matter because suddenly you were part of what had been a French colony,
Hmm.
and the government was almost all the business of government was done in French. So nominally, that should not have mattered, but in effect, it did. Because a lot of the English speakers in the west of the country felt discriminated against because they didn't feel like they had an even chance at things like government jobs, university positions, etc., because they couldn't speak the French that was being used in order to dish out tests, that the applications were written in, all that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And, for a long time, it didn't matter much, but eventually tempers boiled over and a rebellion broke out. It started slowly. At first, it was just protests. But the government doesn't like protests, so they kind of dealt with them somewhat violently, not uncommon for the region. And so the result is that they turned to violence and formed a sort of set of guerrilla bands that began fighting with the government.
These are
It's not
guerrilla
gone, but
bands that sang all of their songs in English.
well, that would have been more peaceful anyway. But as is, they've resorted to kind of preying on the local population in order to continue to fund the war. So, if you're a local in the region, you're squeezed from both sides.
Yeah.
Violent counterinsurgency efforts from the government and then violent efforts at control and extortion by the rebels. So
And
Cameroon overall not as bad as the other countries on that map, but they do have the one region in which they're having to fight.
yeah, that makes
Honestly, I
sense
could have
though.
colored, yeah, honestly, I could have colored more, like Chad and Nigeria, maybe I could have thrown in, but they're not failed states. They're not really at war, not even in terms of a civil war. And they're not even near really being failed states. But they do have a lot of conflict going on, but it's not organized conflict. It's mostly in the form of things like banditry
Hmm.
and maybe the occasional act of terrorism. But it's much more in control there in those two countries than in, say, Mali or Niger, for that matter, certainly Burkina Faso. There's a lot more, of a chaotic environment in those places.
And then what's the country south of Central African Republic? Is that Congo?
Yeah, that's Democratic Republic of the Congo. So most of Congo is actually doing okay. The bigger problem is in the east of the country, near where Rwanda is. Rwanda has allegedly, I don't know that it's been proven per se, but it's kind of just widely accepted that the Rwandan government supports militias in the east of Congo, and that these militias are basically just a means for them to exploit natural resources in the country, especially things like diamonds and other types of things that have pretty good value. So the warlords in eastern Congo will extract that, and then they'll give a cut of that money that they get from that to the Rwandan government in exchange for weapons and other supplies that they need in order to maintain control. So the reason that's relevant is that fighting has flared up again in eastern Congo in the past couple months.
Hmm.
And everybody's pointing fingers at Rwanda, but they're acting innocent, like they don't have anything to do with it. I don't think anybody believes them. But yeah, that technically does qualify Congo. Also, Congo has very, very weak rule of law. It's not a failed state, not quite, but it comes pretty close, especially in the east of the country. Yeah, a lot of the country is not really ruled directly by the government. It's basically just local warlords or authorities of one kind or another, especially in the resource-rich areas. Really the government only has strong control in the west of the country, which is more where the capital is.
Mm-hmm. And Congo, I believe, is pretty jungly and lush relative
Oh
to some
yeah.
other parts of Africa.
Oh yeah, that's where the Congo River is, and that whole basin is basically rainforest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the easiest terrain, to live in.
Or drive tanks over.
No.
And then
That's all to the. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, what's the country north of Nigeria that's red?
Oh, that's Niger.
Niger, yeah. What's their issue at the moment?
Oh, it's the same problem as the rest of the Sahel, bandits, Islamists, what have you.
Mm.
And just, a lack of government capacity with which to deal with those threats generally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, I could have colored pretty much every country in the Sahel. Technically they all have the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if I'm going to do Niger, I should do Chad too, because they're actually pretty similar in regards to how they're handling the problems and the degree of severity.
Mm-hmm.
But Mali and Burkina Faso definitely stand out. Yeah, they'd be there regardless.
And those are the two that are to the west of Niger?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
And probably most of the countries that I've highlighted, well, that I've colored red here, actually, in Africa, I mean, specifically the African countries, actually have some degree of presence by the Wagner Group, the Russian paramilitary organization controlled by Grigory Prigozhin.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those countries do have some degree of Russian influence in them and have lost a great deal of French influence. The French have traditionally wielded the most influence in West Africa, but over the past 10 years, they've been slowly getting edged out. Partly just because they're unpopular, since they were, the colonizer, inherently unpopular in that sense. But also the Russians have really been pushing hard to try to cut deals with local leaders and whatnot, to try to provide security, to deal with the banditry and Islamists and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
The Mali government in particular went out of its way to try to call in Wagner Group mercenaries to help them out. I don't know that it's really helping much. Problems like that, insurgencies and whatnot, they're inherently difficult to deal with. So mercenaries or not, it's not likely to make much of a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chat's asking, what was the definition for the failed state criteria? Government doesn't have control over their country and there's an active resistance somewhere?
In academia, terms like that frequently have a whole multitude of different definitions. I think for me, I'm using the definition here of a state that has basically collapsed and lacks the ability to exert authority over its own territory. So Haiti is probably a failed state at this point, if it wasn't already, but especially with the recent goings on.
Mm.
Somalia is a failed state because the government there doesn't exert any authority outside of basically the capital, Mogadishu.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've gained some territory, but really most of the territory that's loyal to them is actually controlled by the Autonomous Republic of Puntland, I believe is the name. Basically, it's the northern province of Somalia. Government authority collapsed in Somalia in 1990 or thereabouts. But it was really only the southern half of Somalia that became totally chaotic. The northern half of Somalia actually held together under the authority of local government administration. So in the case of Somaliland, which was the northwestern part of Somalia, they actually just declared independence and tried to become their own country. But in the case of the northeastern province, the province of Puntland, they did not declare independence. They didn't really try to help the rest of Somalia. I don't know that they were really able to. It was just, a regional government basically. But they did hold together in terms of like rule of law and whatnot. So they did not quite collapse to the same degree as southern Somalia, which was just dominated by local warlords. There was basically just no government authority there over the past 30 years.
Turns out governing is hard.
Quite a bit. And as you can see with the map, it's been getting harder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of that stuff has to do with climate change, especially in the Sahel. Desertification is kind of pushing herders off of their traditional lands, and they're competing a lot more with farmers for territory. So that's acted as a major driver for conflict, which is kind of spiraling out of the capacity of local governments to deal with.
Do you know
All of that. Go ahead.
Do you know what the method is for like countering desertification? You plant trees on the
Yeah,
border.
trees is the one I know about. China does that. China actually was experiencing a lot of desertification in the northern part of their country, because a lot of Mongolia is kind of semi-arid. And that was actually expanding and kind of getting closer to population centers in the northeast of China. So they went out of their way to grow a whole shit ton of trees, well, to plant a whole shit ton of trees in order to try to stem it. And I think that's actually been very successful. As I understand it, the campaign to fight desertification in China is one of the success stories in that category. But I'm sure there's other more, technical stuff that you could do, but I'm not familiar enough with the science to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think China's also been experimenting with cloud seeding to try to deal with arid areas. I don't know how successful that is. I think the technology's come a long way.
Cloud
Let's see,
seeding,
it's
such a sci-fi sounding concept.
yeah, it's interesting technology. It sounds like sci-fi, but it actually does work. Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily a sustainable solution for a prolonged drought, because I think there does have to be moisture in the air for cloud seeding to really work. And obviously, if there's a drought, there's probably not much to work with. But it has been used. It is viable, at least in the short term. So let's see, we're 2 hours in thereabouts, and everything we've talked about is a tangent from when I was talking about Khashoggi and Mohammed bin Salman given immunity.
We do tangents well here. That's one of our strong suits.
Yeah, we can spin them off. I think we did have some questions. Do we have time for that?
Yes.
Let's see. I'll have to find the thing again. There we go. I think there was actually one from Fuzzy Cord last time that I didn't get to. Let's see. Pandemics have killed significantly more people than wars, yet wars seem to get more credit for shaping history in retrospect. For example, World War I had perhaps 9 million combat deaths, while the 1918 influenza pandemic killed somewhere between 17 and 100 million people, per Wikipedia. But we don't seem to credit the 1918 pandemic for changing much of anything, whereas World War I is credited with affecting every aspect of the modern world. Why do you think political systems are so resilient to pandemics, but more sensitive to wars? Well, it's kind of like the difference between an act of God and an act of man, right? So, like, if you get hit by a tornado, that's just random, right? It's an act of God. But wars are not random, right? That's very much purposeful action by people. And we're kind of hardwired to be more concerned about that, right? There's not much you can do about the weather. I mean, relatively speaking, but there is something you can do about the threat posed by a rival tribe or rival country or rival empire, which is to try to mobilize an army to fight them, to stop them. So I don't know that it's necessarily the case that political systems are more resilient to pandemics than wars. You know, they are pretty vulnerable to both under the right circumstances. But the issue is that wars are much more manageable. You know, there's tangible action you can take, much more so than against a pandemic. You know, I'm not saying there's nothing you can do in the event of a pandemic, but the random nature of their occurrence and the difficulty of containing them, as we've seen with COVID, makes it much harder for governments to mobilize against them. And so people have much lower expectations there. But people have much higher expectations of a state's ability to defend them against a foreign invasion. So there's more you can do and expectations are higher. I think probably that's the key. Maybe not the most satisfying answer, but you know, that's the gist of it. Also, wars tend to be more impactful in so much as they impact boundaries, historically speaking. It's not something we've seen much in the past couple decades, but historically, wars generally had a dramatic impact on which territories were controlled by who. Whereas you can't really say the same about a pandemic. You know, maybe a pandemic can empty out a territory of people. You know, you mentioned specifically the 1918 influenza pandemic, right? So that can kill a lot of people, dramatically impact, you know, societies, economies, etc. But it doesn't necessarily result in, you know, territory being occupied by a hostile enemy. So some of it is just psychological in that sense. Like people are just more worried about being dominated by other people than they are about dying to some random thing that they may or may not have much control over.
Psychology shorthand of that answer is that it's a matter of emotional salience. Which situation seems more remarkable rather than which one is necessarily more impactful.
Let's see. And then the next question was, is there any reason we could not switch to stable currency where money can't be printed, aka stolen from all those that hold already printed notes? I mean, yeah, you could. There's no like inherent technical reason that we could not do that. I mean, if nothing else, you could just like pass a law or something that bans the Department of Treasury from printing new money. So in fact, you could do something like that. But I mean, monetary policy is such a useful and important tool to managing the economy that it's pretty unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're asking why we can't do something more technical, like adopt a currency that is inherently incapable of being printed, something like gold or some weird crypto thing, it seems like there's always ever more complicated and innovative forms of cryptocurrency. So, you know, you could do something like those, but, you know, fundamentally, while that's possible, it's undesirable from a commercial standpoint. And so it's highly unlikely the major institutional investors and, you know, the other major movers and shakers of the American economy, if not the global economy generally, are going to be for that. And it's them who you have to get on board. Because, you know, people are important to the global economy, but really institutional actors are the real drivers of international commerce. And so what currencies they use, what technologies they use, those are really their use of those things really determines the ebb and flow and standards of the international trade. And if you're a major actor engaged in international trade, you know, maybe in finance where you're dealing with like trillions of dollars every day, or maybe one of the other major manufacturers that has trade all over the world, if you're one of those actors, fiat currency is actually really, really useful. because it's really, really liquid. And because you have constant operations, constant turnover, constant trade, and constant changes in markets and market sentiments, it's really nice to be able to have ready access to a really liquid currency that you can borrow just readily, virtually whenever you want. That's going to be much harder to do with something like gold, or presumably a cryptocurrency, which in effect behaves very similar to a commodity like gold. In general, the fact that you cannot readily increase the supply inherently limits the liquidity of the currency in question. Historically, that's been the big criticism of commodity-based currencies. When times are tough, people hoard them, and then there's a shortage, and that makes the economic downturn even worse. So from an economist perspective and from the perspective of major international traders, that is not a desirable outcome. Much better to have a fiat current, a fiat. Is it fiat or fiat? I'm always
Fiat.
getting fiat. Thank you. I'm always forgetting. So from their perspective, a fiat currency is much preferable because it's just much easier on them, like from a business perspective. So yes, technically possible to have a stable currency in the vein that you're referring to here, but realistically speaking, it would never be practical. Well, maybe it could be practical, but like from a political economy perspective, like major economic actors are major influencers of political outcomes. And so for that reason, I doubt it would happen. You would need a huge wellspring of support among the rest of society, basically, to offset the influence of major international traders to the point where you could get something like that even considered. And even then, it would be a hugely contentious debate. So that's all we had for questions. Not the sexiest answers, but it's the best I can do off the top of my head. Oh, I haven't done the usual disclaimer yet. This would probably be a good time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, more painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. And I do learn a lot from chat when we do these. So, it's always fun to kind of see the corrections and whatnot, as well as people contributing their own, stories and information. So chat's participation is encouraged in that regard.
Moss Neotech's favorite part.
Glad he likes it. I'm certainly happy to provide it. An honest representation of me on here and my somewhat limited ability to cover some of this stuff. It's my best effort. It's not always professional. Let's see, what else did we have for today? Did you see the jobs numbers for December?
I did not. How are they looking?
Pretty robust. We're still adding jobs, apparently, in the U.S. economy. Yeah, that's good news for the economy and its health overall, but it's kind of bad news for inflation. So probably the Fed. That's at least supportive evidence for the Fed to kind of continue hiking rates, which will probably make economic activity harder and in turn probably contribute to a downturn, in the upcoming year at some point. Maybe we can avoid it, but it seems unlikely. It seems like it's going to be a cyclical downturn. But we'll see. Yeah, mostly just miscellaneous stuff today. I didn't have anything particularly hot and sexy for everybody, so not one of the more exciting outings today.
People are saying that inflation numbers are going down.
Kind of. Yeah, the inflation rate has gone down some. I think a lot of that has been, what was it? Food has gone down. Energy, that's the main one. Oil and gas have gone down. So that's kind of brought down the headline inflation rate more than anything. More important than the fact that they've gone down is the fact that there's a trend. So they are trending downwards at this point, which actually is very good news. But I don't think the Fed is going to trust that very much if the overall economy still is as robust as it is. Jobs numbers are still very good. Uh, the economy just in general seems to continue to be expanding for some reason. Consumption is still very high. People are having to borrow to maintain consumption, but it is kind of continuing to maintain a relatively high level. So it doesn't seem like the economy is trending downwards in terms of overall output. So that's more what the Fed is going to be concerned with than the headline inflation rate. Yeah, keep an eye on that going forward. That'll be one of the big stories this year. This is just trivia here, but over in China, they had the protests in order to end zero COVID. And I guess it kind of worked. I mean, they did end zero COVID, and the protests probably were principally responsible, but I kind of suspect there was an internal debate within the party about whether or not to do that even before the protests happened. And I suspect Xi Jinping may have been more flexible on that than we had given him credit for before. Maybe he's just so powerful at this point that he doesn't care anymore. If one of his trademark policies ends up getting reversed, or maybe there's just more dissent and infighting within the party than we realize. It's just not entirely clear. But regardless, they did end zero COVID. So now, of course, if you've been paying attention to China, you know that there's been a huge outbreak. Well, maybe not outbreak. COVID was already in China, but it spread just rapidly. Like everybody and their mother is getting COVID now in China. So that's led to some backlash to the backlash, so to speak. There are some people complaining now about the people who are protesting. And so the phrase on the Chinese internet has been something like slacking off crooks. It's an interesting turn of phrase. Apparently, the literal translation is lying flat bandits, which is, I know it's a little weird, but it's actually a reference to lying flat, which you may remember was a phrase that was used by, I don't want to say dissidents per se, but basically people in China who were tired of the work culture in China, which is pretty extreme in a lot of cases. There's a lot of pressure on people to work very hard. And some people were tired of that and decided to basically just check out. And so the phrase they adopted was lying flat. I'm not going to work hard anymore. I'm just going to try to get by. I'm going to lie flat. So that came to be associated with the protesters. And so now this new phrase, lying flat bandits, has been kind of bandied about as an insult. Let's see, what else did we have? There was a new law being proposed in the United States. I don't think we talked about this before, but it's called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. It was introduced, by Amy Klobuchar. I'm never going to pronounce her name right. I'm always going to get it wrong. I can never remember if it's Klobuchar, or just...
Klobuchar.
There you go. Let's go with that. But yeah, she's still in Congress, and she proposed this. And basically, this is part of a plan to try to protect small media outlets. Because one of the trends in media over the past couple of decades has been that they've been losing a lot of advertising revenue to online companies, especially the big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And, there have been different ideas about how to try to deal with that, but nobody's really come up with anything sound or particularly solid. So the result is that a lot of smaller media outlets, especially like local newspapers that have traditionally filled an important role in local civil society, have been going out of business. So that's obviously left a big hole in terms of civil society in the United States at the local level. So what to do? So This law proposes to give media outlets, I think below a certain size. I don't think they want to give, any more power to the big media companies. But if you're below a certain size, then you'll actually be given the right to negotiate with advertisers as a block. So if you want to say advertise with Facebook or something, instead of advertising as a small company, in which case you have limited leverage, you'll be able to group together with all the other small media outlets and in turn get a much better deal. So the idea there is that you're going to try to you're going to try to redistribute relatively more advertising revenue back towards those small media outlets. It's not necessarily going to be a game changer per se. I don't know that it's going to reverse the tide of, small media firms going out of business, but it should help. It's something. And this law has actually already been implemented in Australia. They had the same idea, basically. It actually led to kind of a showdown between Facebook and the Australian government. Facebook actually stopped allowing people to, I think it was post links to news articles on Facebook. Well, no, that's not what it was. Let me correct that. Facebook itself will actually show you news articles that it thinks you want to see according to their algorithm. And so in retaliation for this new law, they stopped doing that. They basically cut them off. And so that kind of hit the revenue of the media outlets a bit. So the Australian government kind of called the bluff basically and refused to change it. And so they ended up coming to an agreement in which Facebook would recognize this sort of new consortium of small media firms. So that law is in effect in Australia, and it does seem to have had the desired effect to some degree. So the United States is on the same track now. But I would point out the new law has not actually been passed. This is still being negotiated. Thus far, the act has only been introduced, not actually adopted. So we'll see where it goes. I'm sure if it actually does come close to being passed, there will be a lot of debate in the United States government about it, because no doubt Facebook and other tech companies are going to fight against it. So there will probably be a whole last PR campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So something to look forward to in 2023. Let's see some other stuff. Not really a whole lot. Oh, Japan beefed up its defense budget. They're going to double their defense budget over the course of the next 5 years. Yeah, they had been spending 1% of GDP on their military, and now they're going to spend 2%, which doesn't sound like much, but that is actually a doubling of the budget. So their military will have a 100% increase in resources available to it. Pretty substantial rather. Yeah, the only question really, and they have committed to this, it's not like Germany where they say they're going to do it, but then they kind of half-ass it, and it's not clear if they're going to sustain it over the long term. In Japan's case, they actually have like a real plan to significantly increase the military budget, and they've committed to it. But the issue, though, is where the money is going to come from, because they already spent a pretty decent amount of money on their military. So, doubling it is going to be a pretty heavy lift. So the question is, where do they get the tax revenue for that? They could borrow it, but they're already, leveraged to the gills as is. I think they're like 200% debt to GDP already in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So they're probably not in a position to borrow a whole lot more. 266%. There you go. So the amount of total debt the Japanese government holds is equivalent to 266% of their annual GDP. I think 100% is considered the red line, beyond which you have problems. So they're well into the red zone there. They get away with it because most of their debt is held by Japanese citizens. So hypothetically, in a pinch, the Japanese government could actually just tax that debt back from the citizenry. That would not be popular. That would mean a huge chunk of money would basically be extracted from the savings of the general population.
So that would be like whenever we got the COVID relief check in the mail, but it would be like a reverse check. Like, no, actually,
Yeah,
you now need to pay us $2,000.
yeah, that's pretty much what it would be, effectively. That pretty much would be a de facto tax, if you like. But because all of the debt is held in Japan like that, uh, well, the vast majority of it anyway, Japan is not as vulnerable to foreign speculation, like with, say, a developing country. So even though their debt is just way, way in the red, it hasn't been a problem yet because there's no financial actors outside of the country that have the kind of leverage they would need in order to significantly cause like a, what would you call it? A speculative run, basically. They can't destroy the value of the yen by pulling out all of their assets like they did in Thailand, during the Asian financial crisis back in the day. Hypothetically, actors within Japan who do own the debt could do that. They could dump all of that debt because they don't think the government's ever actually going to pay it back. But that's never going to realistically happen because in Japan, the political economy, rather, is much more cooperative than it is in the West. So Japan and its leading economic institutions have a very, critics would say the relationship is incestuous, but in general, it's very tight. So even though they're separate entities, even though corporate Japan and the Japanese government are separate entities and they kind of are supposed to operate separately, in practice, the Japanese government has a lot of influence over corporations and can kind of lean on them to do certain things that it wants them to do for the sake of development. So, one of the things that the Japanese government does in that vein is to lean on institutional investors to, one, borrow money from the Japanese government. Well, not borrow money, to buy debt from the Japanese government, rather. And then, two, not dump all of that debt because they don't think it's going to be paid back. So you could say that there's an opportunity cost there that, Japanese corporations and banks in particular could make a lot more money if they were able to invest their money how they want it rather than how the Japanese government is pressuring them to. There's some truth to that. So that lost value, the opportunity cost of doing that is a kind of de facto tax on the Japanese financial system exacted by the Japanese government in order to maintain the stability of the nation's finances. So that's a pretty indirect public policy tool by which to maintain financial stability, but it works. Again, 266% of GDP, debt to GDP rather, and still no collapse. So obviously they're doing something right. Yeah, the only issue there is that there's just not a lot of room to maneuver. Like if they do need to borrow a whole shit ton more money, the country itself is already kind of leveraged, right? Pretty much everybody who can lend to the Japanese government money has done so. So if they need to spend a whole lot in the short term, they're probably going to have to borrow internationally. And that may or may not be feasible. If the Japanese government did have to borrow a whole bunch more money, the only way it could realistically work is if they agreed to prioritize foreign lenders, because otherwise foreign lenders would look at that 266 number and would basically refrain from lending. They would halt. It would just be too high for them, I think.
Mm.
So basically, there's going to be a debate in Japan about tax revenue. They're going to have to try to raise that somehow. Probably, if I had to guess, they're going to do it by passing a whole bunch of small taxes that collectively raise a lot of money, but that individually don't raise much. I think that would probably be the least intrusive way that they could do it. Hypothetically, they could just hike something like income taxes or corporate taxes or something, but income tax hikes are very unpopular politically, and the current government is already pretty unpopular because of a series of scandals in Japan. And then corporate tax increases could generate a fair amount of revenue, but the issue there is that Japan is an export-dependent economy, and taxing your economic driver is not great. You need to do it some, but taxing it heavily is going to do more damage than good. You can ask Argentina about that. I'm sure Dagnip would have something to say about that, but in general, my impression is that the leading economic drivers in Argentina, especially the agricultural sector, tend to be overregulated and overtaxed. Although I don't doubt there's a fair amount of smuggling and tax evasion going on, to be fair. And hopefully Dagnep is doing okay.
Yep, they were in the chat before we got started.
Yeah, things have been kind of rough in Argentina, so do take care down there. Well, the only other thing of substance I kind of had to talk about today was Brexit, which we haven't talked about in a while, but that is an ongoing thing.
Oh.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before that there were some, residual negotiations going on about the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall that?
Mm-hmm.
So there has been more traction on that. So the European Union itself agrees that, the protocol is intrusive. It's just a little too inflexible. That was kind of by design. The European Union during the Brexit negotiations really wanted to make it clear that it was willing to fight for the integrity of the European Union and for the interests of its member states. But the result is that they had to kind of agree to certain things that were probably, well, they tried to push aspects of the Brexit agreement that were probably more inflexible than they needed to be. To be fair, the circumstances of the negotiation and the objectives of the negotiation were less than ideal. Creating a border between, well, recreating a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland was always going to be very difficult. So trying to hash out like some kind of free trade agreement wherein the UK still has some access to the European single market, but can still make free trade deals with countries outside of the European Union, that was always going to be really complicated. So the best that they could do was the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so that inherently meant customs checks on goods and services going, well, goods mostly, going from the British mainland, Great Britain, to Northern Ireland. But that was very disruptive to business in Northern Ireland. And so that resulted in political dysfunction in Northern Ireland. The government basically ceased to function. I think the leading party straight up refused to take office in protest. And so the British government went out of its way then, both to, try to appeal to the Northern Ireland voting bloc, which kind of has its own political party, the DUP, but just also because they wanted to try to, legitimately address those grievances, to try to get the European Union to agree to some kind of calibration of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And it was all pretty technical. A lot of it was basically just that they wanted certain goods from certain traders to be given the opportunity to have their stuff fast-tracked through the customs process. And the European Union had been pretty reluctant to do that because the suspicion and concern on the part of the European Union has been that the British are kind of low-key trying to maintain access to the European single market, even though they're no longer members of the European Union, which is going to be unfair, basically, to everybody who is part of the European Union and still has to adhere to all of these rules and regulations correspondent with being a member of the European Union. Britain doesn't have to do any of that stuff, but they could hypothetically maintain access to the single market if they can trade through and across the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Hence the Northern Ireland Protocol and the customs checks in British Western ports. But anyway, they're going to come to some kind of agreement on that count. The European Union is much more flexible on that at this point. They do recognize that there can be some changes there that would not threaten the integrity of the European Union and which would address British concerns. So unlike before, when people were basically just grandstanding to make, for the sake of grandstanding effectively, on both sides, now there actually does seem to be some traction on an agreement there. So we'll see.
We did just get a massive raid from Artosis. Some people are a little bit confused about what's going on. Artosis is one of the huge streamers in the StarCraft sphere and RTS sphere. Cool note for everyone coming in for the raid. There's an interview that I did regarding some things I got to test with Stormgate. I don't know if anyone has been tracking that game that's in the works, but it is looking super crisp and super fresh. We're doing our Sunday evening world discussion segment that we host at 6 p.m. Pacific time usually. We started a little bit late today. But we talked about quite a few countries in the world, and we do read chat and respond to stuff. So if you have a serious question about stuff, feel free to let us know. But to give you a little bit of memes, because I know Artosis viewers love memes, one of the favorite countries of Twitch chat is actually Djibouti. Is there anything that's been happening in Djibouti recently?
I don't think so. I think they've been pretty well behaved overall. They've been keeping out of the headlines.
Well,
yeah, they've been pretty fortunate in that regard. It's definitely been a rough neighborhood the past couple of years.
Well, it's good they're staying out of the headlines. That would be mooning if they were in the headlines.
I guess that's one way of putting it. No, yeah, there's still, center of anti-piracy operations, and I think important way station, if you like, for ships traveling through the Suez Canal. But beyond that, I don't think they've been too active. Been pretty quiet overall.
Chat says, okay, what about the conflict with Armenia, Turkey, Azerbaijan?
Oh God, yeah, that's the thing. I think you remember when we talked about the war, right? When Azerbaijan and Armenia were fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of went back to being a frozen conflict. The Azeris were able to take a whole bunch of territory in Nagorno-Karabakh, but they were not able to take all of it. They basically had to stop just short of the capital, Stepanakert. I think the Armenians call it Stepanakert. I think the Azeris have a different name for it. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, yeah, they had to freeze the conflict in place as a result of negotiations mediated by the Russian government. And so, the way things ended, effectively, the Azeris were able to were able to completely surround Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed territory in question. So the Armenians still control the interior of the province, but because they're completely surrounded, they're de facto cut off. However, part of the agreement that was made was that the Armenians would be allowed to use the freeway connecting Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia, so they can still send supplies, although I don't know if it necessarily extends to troops. But regardless, implementation of that agreement was very much at the mercy of the Azeris, who actually controlled that highway in practice. They actually had troops on the ground. And so actual observance of the agreement and the allowance of Armenians, the allowance of Armenian access to that highway has been somewhat spotty. There has been intermittent clashes along the demarcation line between territories occupied by the Azeris and the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's kind of been an ongoing thing since the war ended for, the past year and a half or however long it's been. But more recently, there's been new developments because there's been protests near Stepanakert, specifically in the Azeri-controlled territory. There are environmentalists, quote unquote, who are protesting and have set up a protest camp very near to Stepanakert. And the concern is that these protesters are not real protesters, but that they're just being paid by the Azeri government to give them an excuse to move into new territory that they had not been able to take during the war itself. So there's been some drama over that. But other than that, I think it's been relatively quiet. I think the trend is more towards a potential resumption of fighting, though, because the Russians are, again, preoccupied in Ukraine, so they don't really have the heft at this point to really stop the Azeris if they want to go for broke and actually take back the whole territory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Armenians, for their part, are basically, have been screaming from the start of the conflict for the Russians to come in and help them because they're actually part of a treaty called the Collective something, or what was it? CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, something like that. It's basically like a Russian equivalent of NATO. They have it's a mutual defense agreement that Russia has with multiple other countries, Armenia among them. And according to the terms of the treaty, an attack on one member is supposed to be considered an attack on all. So you can imagine Armenia's frustration when Azerbaijan attacks Nagorno-Karabakh and then the Russians pretty much do fuck all.
When was CISTO formed?
It was formed after the Cold War ended, I want to say like mid-90s. I think the Russians were relatively quick to make it. They were trying to kind of maintain what residual influence they could over former Soviet territories in particular. So it's been around a while, but it hasn't really been used much because there hasn't been a lot of wars in the region for the past couple decades.
Yeah, I remember you did a map for us that had the countries of it, I think.
Yeah, we did NATO and CISTO, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, CISTO's membership is not like super strong. Russia's easily the most powerful member. I think other than that, it's Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and I think that's about it. Uzbekistan used to be a member, but then they dropped out. And I think they've been kind of teasing the Russians that they might come back over the past couple of years, but they never actually seem to do it. So, maybe they're just trying to get some kind of concession there. But yeah, it's not a whole lot of countries, and they're not very strong. So, but anyway, Russia is supposed to be a guarantor of Armenia's security, but Russia pointed out after the fact, well, actually during the fact, that Nagorno-Karabakh was not technically part of Armenia, and so therefore the treaty was not technically triggered by the Azerbaijani invasion.
We don't technically need to help you.
Yeah, technically that was true because the Armenians never actually annexed Nagorno-Karabakh. Rather, Nagorno-Karabakh had its own provincial government that the Armenian government recognized as a separate government. But that was also kind of bullshit because the governments actually had a lot of ties and the Armenian military actually was deployed in Nagorno-Karabakh. So de facto, it was a part of Armenia, even if technically it wasn't. But because they engaged in that sort of legalistic pussyfooting, that opened the door for Russia to kind of cite that as a reason not to get involved. At least not beyond mediation, anyway. So as a result, when the invasion happened, the Russians stayed out. The Armenians kind of got steamrolled. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that bad, but they definitely lost the war anyway. So the best they could do was to kind of refreeze the conflict. But unless the Russians are willing to kind of lean on the Azeris more, that may just be a matter of it may just be a matter of time before they resume their offensive and try to liberate/conquer Nagorno-Karabakh. Disputed territories are always tricky. Which word you use kind of depends on your framing and your perspective. Yeah, part of the problem is that Turkey has been supporting Azerbaijan. They actually have pretty good relations at this point. Part of that has to do with energy. A good chunk of the natural gas that Azerbaijan exports, if not also the oil, gets exported via pipeline that runs through Turkey. So they have good impetus, they have good reason to manage their ties, and to work together. It would not behoove either of them to have a falling out. But the Turkish government has also been using that relationship as an outlet for some of their military industry. They've been trying to export more, and Azerbaijan has been a willing partner in that regard. And Azerbaijan in particular has been buying from Turkey because Turkey doesn't have nearly as many restrictions on the stuff that they sell. The United States infamously has a whole bunch of restrictions placed on export of UAVs, for example. So they do that for security reasons because the United States government does not want a whole bunch of UAVs in rogue countries and whatnot. But the downside is that the UAV industry in the United States has been somewhat hobbled. They would make a lot more money if they could export abroad. As is, they've lost all of that market share to countries with less developed UAV industries that can't really compete as well against American producers, but in the absence of American production, easy pickings. So Turkey is one example of a country that's taken advantage of that. But I think it also extends to other technologies. I'm just not as familiar with the full range there. Regardless, Turkey supplies them with a lot of arms they wouldn't necessarily be able to get it otherwise, and that's resulted in the Azerbaijani military being much stronger than you might think. It's a resource rich country, like lots of natural gas exports, oil exports. So they have a lot of money to burn. So between the quality of Turkish exports and the sheer scale of military expenditures in Azerbaijan, they've definitely got a big military advantage over Armenia at this point. And so that's given them renewed impetus, especially over the past couple of years, to try to press their claim to Nagorno-Karabakh and try to take advantage of that, take advantage of their advantage in military spending and in the quality of their material, which is why the conflict has gotten hot again, since 2021 or so. Well, I don't want to drag things out unnecessarily.
Well, it's all good.
Yeah, again, I just don't have much to work with. Yeah, I could have gone more into like detailed stuff, but I didn't have anything in my notes to that effect.
Chat, off the cuff, what's a country you want to learn something about? Random country, any country.
Actually, Fatum isn't watching, right? I think he's still asleep, right?
Yeah, he should be asleep at about this point.
Okay.
We did talk about Lebanon. We've had multiple people say Iceland.
Iceland. Well, that's a weird one. Well, it's a very small country demographically. I don't think it even has 1 million people. Let me check.
Population of Iceland.
Yeah, 372,520 people. So that's less people than Wyoming. And Wyoming doesn't have a lot of people, so that's saying something.
Would you say Wyoming is a world hegemon?
Not quite. They've got a ways to go. Yeah, Iceland used to be a part of, what was it? It was like Denmark or something. It's one of the Scandinavian countries. And then ended up separating, I want to say in like the 19th century or so. I mean, it's very isolated, so it's not particularly vulnerable. And relations with the major naval powers have been pretty good historically. And it's not like they have a whole lot of resources that make them an attractive conquest. So they've been able to chill for most of their history. Yeah, World War II kind of ended that, though. Yes, maybe isn't like the best known aspect of World War II, but it was not just the Axis kind of invading random countries. The Allies actually did it a bit too. And one of the such countries was Iceland. So I think everybody, well, if you're familiar with World War II, you know that Germany invaded Norway, right? Very early on in the war. I think it was like 1940, it would have been, I think. And that went pretty poorly for the Allies, including Norway, especially. But because the Germans managed to get all of that territory, there was a real concern that they might make a play for Iceland and then use it to try to use it as a base for U-boats and use it to project air power into the Atlantic and disrupt the flow of goods and war material generally from the United States to the British. So it was determined that Iceland needed to be secured. And the British actually did that by just straight up invading the island. So there actually was a full-on British invasion of Iceland in World War II as a result. It was not particularly violent because Iceland didn't really have an army at the time. It was basically just police. There was a couple incidents where police fired on some British troops, but for the most part, I don't think casualties ranged any more than a handful. So the British were able to establish control pretty quickly. Now, there's further fun trivia here because the British, for their part, ended up alone fighting Germany for a while after the fall of France. And that really put the squeeze on them in terms of resources and manpower. So in order to try to economize manpower, they actually pulled out most of their troops from Iceland so they could so that they could be redeployed elsewhere. And who do you think they got to replace them?
Viking warriors?
Well, not a bad guess, but no, it was United States Marines,
Oh,
which is interesting because the United States was not at war at the time. We were actually still neutral. But the British government managed to convince the American government that it was in their security interest to participate in the maintenance of Iceland's quote unquote neutrality. And so as a result, the United States actually agreed to send troops to Iceland in order to maintain control of the country, or at least to keep it safe, however you want to frame that. So even though we were not involved directly in the war at the time, we actually did escalate our involvement to some degree. Kind of like with Ukraine almost now. You know, we're not directly involved, but we have been slowly escalating our involvement over time. So we actually did something similar with Iceland in World War II.
there was a random question that I didn't know the answer to in chat. Why did Thailand not ever get taken over by the British?
Oh, that's a complicated one. Basically, short answer is because they played the French and the British off of each other.
Ah.
If you look at a map of colonial holdings in Southeast Asia, you'll see that the French had Indochina, which is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And then to the west of them was technically Burma, but basically, British India, effectively. So Burma at the time was a British holding. So you could say that, there was an incentive for one or the other to push in, but if that had happened, then there would have been some kind of clash, right? At that point, there would have been a border between British and French holdings in Southeast Asia, and that would have created a diplomatic headache. So it was actually much easier from a diplomatic perspective to just have a handshake agreement in which both sides effectively agreed not to expand into Thailand, so that they would not have to engage in the troublesome work of trying to settle who got what part of Thailand.
I see.
So Thailand was quite happy to take advantage of that and preserve their sovereignty as a result. Doesn't mean that they didn't lose territory. The country of Laos was originally a chunk of Thai territory that was broken off by the French. They've never been able to quite get it back, unfortunately for the Thais. But that is an example of territory that they lost to the French. And in the far south of Thailand, there's a bunch of territory that later became northern Malaysia that was originally part of Thailand as well. And the British were able to peel those off and make those colonial holdings as well. So they did lose some territory, but overall they were able to kind of exploit the fact that they were strategically located between two rival powers. And as a result, they were able to stay independent. It was basically the same thing that happened to Afghanistan. Hypothetically, it would have been not too difficult for either Russia or the British to move into Afghanistan and incorporate it into one of their respective empires. But in practice, both recognized that would have led eventually to some kind of clash over the border. And so in order to avoid that, both sides de facto agreed to just let Afghanistan be a buffer state between them. Now, again, this is the simple version of the history. It's actually, much more complicated than that. There was a lot more diplomatic maneuvering and whatnot, in terms of both Thailand and Afghanistan. And this is more the Cliff Notes version of that history. But effectively, that's what happened, and that's why those two countries were able to maintain their independence. Yeah, Ethiopia is another example of a country that avoided colonization, at least up until the 1930s anyway. Their history, the reason they were able to maintain their sovereignty kind of had to do with colonial holdings, but it had more to do with Christianity. It was technically a Christian country, although one with a sizable Muslim minority. One of the justifications for empire building in Europe was to Christianize and civilize people overseas. But in the case of Ethiopia, they already had Christianity.
The people need God. Oh, they already have God. Oh, well, go home then.
Yeah, so in that case, the impetus was not quite there. Yeah, it probably didn't help that there was not a whole lot of natural resources there to be exploited. That probably played a role as well, but the fact that Christians were already there in substantive numbers also acted as a deterrent,
How are they
fortunately for
already
the
there?
Ethiopians. I mean, Christianity spread to Ethiopia very early on.
Oh,
They've actually got one of the older Christian churches in the world.
so kind of like how Egypt has the Coptic Christians or whatever.
Yeah, pretty much. But unlike Egypt, the Islamic faith did not overwhelm the Christian faith in Ethiopia, like it did in Egypt. And so technically, I believe Ethiopia is still majority Christian, although I don't think the margin is that great anymore. But it's still roughly equivalently Islamic and Christian in character, just in terms of like the demographics. Yeah, the reason that Italy invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s was not to spread civilization. It was nominally to end slavery, which was, of course, very unpopular. So nominally, that was the justification. Of course, it was a bullshit justification. Really, they just wanted to take it over just for the sake of, empire building. Uh, but they did use that rationalization, ending slavery, which had been something Ethiopia had been criticized for a long time up till that point. But Europe had not really expressed enough of an outrage at slavery in Ethiopia to actually up and invade them. Italy did, but again, that was just a fake casus belli, effectively.
And it's interesting to me that different religions will reach regions in different waves. Like I think some of the fighting in West Africa between Christians and Muslims is more like recent converts fighting rather than older established sects, but it would have probably started whenever those countries were being colonized by European countries.
West Africa?
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking Central Africa.
Well, there definitely was tension there, but I don't think the Islamic faith had been able to expand to coastal West Africa before European contact. I think that was still open, sort of, well, those territories were free agents, religiously speaking. Yeah, the Islamic faith was able to easily expand across the Sahara Desert. Islam has always been very successful at expanding through pre-existing trade networks. And there was a whole bunch of pre-existing caravan trading networks in the Sahara, well before Islam ever came. So they were able to expand along those networks and convert big swaths of the Sahel and Sahara correspondingly. But a lot of the civilizations in West Africa had actually already existed for a long time before Islam ever got there. And so some of the more developed areas actually somewhat resisted Islamic conversion. Again, mostly along the coast. I think the Niger River basin was pretty successfully converted for the most part. But coastal Nigeria and West Africa was still largely, I guess, what you would call pagan. So when the Christians arrived, they found it relatively easy to convert those people, relatively speaking. There was still resistance, but over time that was broken down. Yeah, clashes between Muslims and Christians in West Africa probably stems more from. I mean, it was managed in the colonial period just because the colonial authorities had a monopoly on violence. And I think after independence, even when that monopoly on violence weakened, because just the new independent states were inherently weaker, I think even then they were able to manage it for the most part. There's always been incidents, but there hasn't been anything systemic that I'm aware of that happened after independence, at least not for several decades. I think it's really more in the modern period, in the past couple decades, when state authority has started to weaken and Islamist terrorism has become something of a trend. That was something that kind of spun out of Al-Qaeda linking up with different, Islamist groups in different countries. So that's where you get like Boko Haram, as well as the Islamists in Mali, for example. So, radical groups like that have definitely instigated more religious conflict, but religious conflict had not been nearly as pronounced before the era of Islamist terrorism that kind of started in the 1980s.
We've talked about that terrorism somewhat and how they kind of viewed a lot of the West as a big evil, and using violent means was something they went for, which not all Islamic sects or groups would go that route. Like, they might still believe that their belief system is the best and the most correct and all that, but trying to blow shit up and scare people, that's a bit of a different tone.
Yeah, a little bit. It doesn't really win hearts and minds much.
No. Everyone disliked that.
Well, I mean, we've only got, 15 minutes left, so
Yeah.
you want to just kind of wrap up a little early today?
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be more stuff going on early in 2023, so we'll probably have more to talk about soon, but for now, we're kind of in between crises. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, much appreciated for having me. It's much appreciated that you let me come on here and kind of board chat with my meanderings.
Man, not bored chat. I get people hassling me from like Friday until we start. Is Agent Smith gonna be on? Is Agent Smith gonna be on? Probably. Yes. He's on.
Yeah, I try. But yeah, it's always fun. Just kind of talking about stuff. History and politics and geography and whatnot.
Heck yeah. Well, cool. You are challenged with a 20-minute walk. I don't know if I had bugged you about that for the past few weeks, but that could be good. It's always nice to get outside. I got the rock climbing in, and my forearms have been jello. I think they were jello for like 4 days. Yeah, it's a different kind of grip strength that I don't usually need to practice. I've been doing the 100 burpees per day. I'm still doing that, but that doesn't really involve grip because my hands are flat on the ground. So yeah, challenge yourself, chat. Do some fitness thing. Maybe even just a 20-minute walk, assuming the weather isn't too terrible.
Yeah, I kind of got dunked on that one time.
Yep. Well, cool.
It happened.
Thanks for coming on. Thank you, Moss Neotech, for handling questions today. And thank you, chat, for contributing to the conversation. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. See you next time.
GG. Nice.